Okay, so hi, Professor Chan. So this is going to be my live presentation. I have my cousin in the presentation because it wouldn't let me create a Zoom just by myself. So I just added someone in there. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then we'll get started. And then make sure you have like my face next to the other face. So just so it doesn't look a little weird. Okay, share my screen. Okay. I'm gonna put it in presenter mode just so it looks a little bit better. Okay, let's get started. So this is my open court case final portfolio. My name is Paris Perry, and it's about the fight to free Jermaine Smothers. So this is going to be our table of contents. So first, we're going to talk about the importance of BLM artifacts, and then we're going to talk about each BLM artifact that influenced me throughout the course of my English 109H experience. And then we're going to introduce Jermaine Smothers, kind of like an acknowledgement of who he is and what he's been through. And then we're going to talk about my thesis and who he is exactly, what his situation entails. Then we're going to talk about our audience, and then we're going to introduce you to my research opportunities and what exactly I use to help me discover more about this case. And then we're going to do the prediction of his verdict once his case is open up. And then we're going to do some closing remarks on my experience and what I've learned from this course, and then my works cited page. So let's get started. So throughout the course, we've had multiple activities and assignments that prepare us for our essays and portfolios. So these assignments have greatly influenced me because they've shown me what aspects and important roles that I need to include into my principles. So I used most of these artifacts. So the main ones that I used were my essay one, the Tamika Palmer podcast assignment, the People versus Messerl assignment, and the BLM principles exercise where we personalize them to ourselves. So when I was using these specific assignments for my open court case portfolio, it really allowed me to provide a more personal and emotional compilation of like what I needed in my open case portfolio. And now I could move this on and allow it to give me more intricate detail on what the BLM movement is and how I can make a statement through this portfolio. So the first artifact that I'm going to go over is the Rodney King artifact. So my essay one was called Rodney King Forgiving White America, and it was basically a rendition or a narrative of a specific BLM victim of our choice. And I had always been very interested in Rodney King, not only his situation, but him as a person because of what he had been through before and after the beating. And also I was into the events that I portrayed in South Central LA during that time. So this had to be one of my favorite essays that I wrote. It really helped me learn how to incorporate my senses and kind of like portray a story, even though the story had already took place. It allowed me to actually create a story, even though there had already been one to begin with. But I was able to use more of my senses and use more details to kind of like drag the writer in, and that was something that I used throughout this entire experience through my course and throughout this open case court portfolio, was to provide it with a more emotional approach and not to forget who Rodney King was and why I needed to bring justice to him. So my second artifact would be Tamika Palmer, The Life of Breonna Taylor, and in the words of her mother. So this really allowed me. So in this activity, we used our senses, kind of picked out specific parts of the podcast where we saw Tamika Palmer using her senses to kind of portray to the audience. And this was something that was really interesting because I never kind of took the time to look at an article and use, okay, when are they using like a hearing sense? When are they using a visual sense? When are they using a taste sense? Just to kind of like provide a more interpersonal relationship with the reader. And that was something that I thought was really beautiful, was to see that the victims were more than just the victims. They had lives, they had families, and there was something more important about them than just what happened to them. So I think in paying attention to this, I was able to connect those senses to Jermaine's case and kind of absorb myself into knowing that he was more than just his past. He was also a person with a family and friends who cared about him. And this is one of the quotes from Tamika Palmer's podcast. She said, "I just can't believe it. I felt like with the whole pandemic, Brianna would be forgotten and we would just get swept under the rug. And how do I feel then? Like, my God, somebody heard me. Like, I finally caught my breath. That's how I feel. Like, I finally caught my breath." So it really comes to show that we really do need to bring justice to these victims because more than often not, they're forgotten. And society has a way of kind of posting them maybe once or twice on their Instagram stories to show that they're in alliance, but then the next day they'll completely forget about it. It's something like we can't forget about these victims. We can't forget what happened to them because what's happening to them is so cruel and unjust, and we have to stand up. So the next artifact that I'm going to go over is the BLM principles and exercise. So it's empathy and being unapologetically Black. Those are the two principles that I chose for myself. So in incorporating these principles into my final portfolio, I use empathy because I kind of suffer from hyper empathy. I usually put myself in positions of others, which kind of makes me become more emotional in my senses. I kind of use this as a fact in my essays and kind of making it more emotional than it is factual, kind of trying to portray to the masses. Because more often than not, we can portray to someone's emotions, and we can't often portray to someone's, like, if we give them facts, they're really not going to understand it. But if you, okay, put yourself in his shoes, more than likely they're going to know what you're talking about. So I think that that's something that I really want to do through this portfolio, and this exercise allowed me to learn more on how to do that while incorporating facts. And I also want to take the time to acknowledge that race did play a role in this trial. I mean, race plays a role in most of all Black Lives victims' situations. So we need to constantly remember that it's easier to try him because of what he looks like and his race, especially for people of all color. It's a lot more easier for them to be subjected to the injustices because of what they look like. And then the last BLM artifact I'm going to talk about is the people versus Mercil. So this open court, actually this is a closed court case, but it helped me with my open court case because it allowed me to become more familiar with the legal jargon. I was very I want to say kind of lacking in that field. I'm not familiar with a lot of the legality forms of open court case, and it's a little difficult for me to read those. So I think becoming familiar with how they usually use this in a trial and just the intricate details that they pick out of each and every trial, just how they were trying to say the manner in which Mercil grabbed his gun and what state of mind he was actually in, that was basically the basis for the entire trial. And it was kind of hard to keep up with that. Like, how was he grabbing his gun? What would a normal person, an actual person, have done in his situation? So it's kind of like this constant, what would people actually do, but we don't know what we would actually do. It's just going back and forth with what this normality is, but is there even a normality? So it's like these specific details mean something, and it's the same with Jermaine's case. There were specific details in the case that somehow led the jury to believe that he was guilty, even though there was a lot of evidence that claimed that he was not guilty at all. So before we even move forward to talking about who Jermaine was and what actually happened, I want to take the moment to acknowledge that he is still currently incarcerated for what he's done. He's serving 29 years to life for a murder that he did not commit. He's currently waiting his chance for an exoneration, but we obviously need to give him all the attention that he deserves. This case is not so for a hold in the media because of how much attention it's lacking. So I think we need to, as a society, pay more attention to these little cases of innocent individuals who are incarcerated unfairly, because there are so many of them, and the courts seem to be ignoring this affirmative action that prosecutors and legal officials are taking to try to help them get out of these situations. So I just want to take the moment to acknowledge that and give him all respect through this portfolio. So, who is Jermaine Smothers? So, Jermaine Smothers is a Black male that has been falsely incarcerated for over 25 years. So, the California Innocent Project is currently fighting for him in Oceanside, California. So, on May 11th, 1995, Jermaine Smothers was accused of shooting and killing Ernesto Flores. Jermaine and his friends were chased down by an unknown gunman walking down into the alley of a park. So they were around the crime scene when the shots started to ring. As Jermaine's Jermaine's group ran out of the alley. They were hearing gunshots, and somehow the police arrived. They arrested him, and they started to question him. So when he was being questioned along with all of his friends, they were given polygraph exams, and they spoke to multiple eyewitnesses. In the polygraph exam, they had asked him if he did, in fact, was the shooter. He said no, and he did pass the polygraph exam. And many of the witnesses were unable to identify him because it was so dark, so they never got a look of who the shooter was. But despite all this information, Jermaine was portrayed as the shooter, and he was sentenced in the city of San Diego for 29 years to life for murder and a conspiracy to commit murder. So the case was reopened in 2018 by Detective Kelly Devaney. In 2001, she was working on an unrelated homicide case, which later she was able to tie the details in that case back to Jermaine's case and actually find out who the shooter was, who she believed the shooter to be, because it was not Jermaine. So she brought this case to the California Innocence Project in 2008, and they have been working on it ever since. And then in 2018, they filed a post-conviction petition on Jermaine's behalf with the evidence that proves that the original witnesses were wrong and that the actual criminal is someone else, but it's not Jermaine. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be analyzing the multiple prosecutors who continue to fight for Jermaine and his freedom, and also others who are in the same predicament that he is in, the overall evidence used in the trial, and the overall evidence about the scene of the crime, and how society can continue to help him through just signing a petition. And the legal system, which is something that more than often not people of color are afraid of, constantly works against us, and society is forced to change this through the corrupt aspects of the law, while legal officials are just sitting by and watching injustice unfold under their jurisdiction, which is something that we're going to have to change ourselves. So the audience, who am I trying to reach? So I think that multiple people can benefit from this open case portfolio. So I said that legal officials, prosecutors, public defenders, judges, law enforcement officers, politicians, and BLM activists can hear it. But my main target for this research is younger Black generations. So more often than not, young Black women and men are subject to these situations very early on in their lives. Jermaine was very young when he was incarcerated, and we need to be familiar with these so we're aware of the society around us and the potential threat that our race can play in society. So this portfolio can be used to inform young Black generations on the many injustices that Black men and women face constantly, and becoming more aware of the faulty legal system is a must. So especially since you are a woman of color or a person of color, and the system is constantly working against you, you need to learn how to be able to fight for your truth and fight for your innocence when you are believed to be innocent. So the research, so we're going to move on to the research, and I'm just going to introduce the brief pieces that I use. So I use the Exonerate. It's a article written by the San Diego, California Innocence Project, so kind of like a mix between the two. Free Jermaine, it's a website used specifically to by his followers and supporters to help people learn more about his trial, and then a message to the governor of California specifically to help for his exoneration. So I'm going to emphasize the amount of research that I'm using because it will help more people understand his situation and how we can overall help him, and it's going to be able to form a structure for my final portfolio. So Exonerate. Peace and justice, students sorry. Students find hope in fighting for the wrong and convicted. So 1 second. Okay. So students have been fighting for Jermaine for a very, very long time, but these certain students at the San Diego Innocence Project have been spending their summers interning at the California Innocence Project, CIP, to help government officials and defendants with their mission of freeing the wrongly convicted from prison. So multiple students spend a day or two at the San Diego Supreme Court just listening to what other prosecutors have to say and the representatives that are constantly advocating for Jermaine Smothers by bringing the actual evidence from his trial to support a claim for his exoneration. So he's not currently in the process of being exonerated, but they're working towards this process of actually bringing him back into court. So the CIP is filled with a lot of great people that have used their own time, their own energy, and their own money and their own resources to help fight for the lives of men and women who've been shut out by a system that is supposed to protect them. And the CIP hopes to free Jermaine soon rather than later, while educating the masses on the reformation that needs to be done in the criminal justice system overall. So, free Jermaine, becoming familiar with the case. So, at this time, during the scene of the crime, Jermaine was seen at the crime with his friends, but his ex-girlfriend was nearby the crime along with his mother in the same area. So the crime was happening I want to say a few blocks away from his house. So these women got very close to the crime scene and repeatedly shouting his name, kind of alerting the officers that he was there. So more often than so, the officers kind of they relayed this message back to the precinct, kind of making it as a reason for why they believed Jermaine to be the shooter, because they were constantly yelling his name. So they were forced to believe that maybe he was the culprit, even though they were too far away to actually identify anyone. They were just screaming his name, probably to alert him to come back home because of the shots that they heard. So the detectives and the prosecutors were under a lot of pressure to stop gang violence in this part of Oceanside. So they set out the case extremely quickly. It did not take that long to deliberate this case at all, and to make an example of the culprit, who was Jermaine. So Jermaine was the easiest target out of the entire, because of the testimony of his ex-girlfriend and his mother, who said that he was there. So they more so gave Jermaine away by saying that he was at the crime. So they, even though he wasn't the shooter, they said he was there. So it was kind of a done deal once they had said that, and they used that against him. So the lead detective fixated on Jermaine and ignored other witnesses who had credible leads and that stated Jermaine was the shooter. And multiple witnesses that said that the shooter was very tall and that he was left-handed, and Jermaine was the shortest and he was right-handed. So it was kind of a flip-flop on that. He was not easy target, especially by the eyewitnesses of a shooter, but they put the crime on him. So the public defender was surprised by the vast amount of information in the case and how much information was going to be able to prove him innocent, yet he was still proven guilty. So the jury would take a little over 2 hours to deliberate and find Jermaine guilty. So over the years, Jermaine has fought this decision, but still remains in prison for over 25 years. So the governor of California, over 25 years of false incarceration, we want to free Jermaine Smothers. So I took this petition. I signed this petition. If you just highlight this entire the title and put it in the Google search bar, the petition will pop up. It's the first thing that pops up, and you can go ahead and sign the petition. They're still looking for a lot more signatures on it. So this one had a quote from Jermaine that I want to just read. So it says, "I was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana on July 14th, 1975. I was an average student that excelled in sports. My father was in the military. So I've had the opportunity to travel quite a bit. We lived in North Carolina, Japan, and California. I have 2 sisters and a brother. My only child is my son, Jermaine Jr. He is 26 years old now, so I've missed all but 8 months of his life. Before coming to prison, I was working and taking care of my family. I wasn't a deadbeat. I wasn't trying to turn my life around for him and my family. I wasn't perfect, but I never murdered anyone. I was extremely close to my mother. She was my favorite girl until she passed away from cancer in 2008. One of the hardest times I had to face while in prison was not being able to say goodbye to her and not her seeing me walk out these gates. Not being able to raise my son is equally hard. I was looking forward to watching him grow up and become an outstanding young man." So right now, Jermaine spends his time in prison rehabilitating himself and trying to protect other Black men in his same society and the same parts of those California neighborhoods from being subjected to having to go into gang violence, because it's something that they see as their only option, but it's not. And sorry, this is looking a little emotional, but the words that Jermaine had said about just not being able to see his mother before he died, that sorry, that was a little hard, because he just wasn't able to free himself before he wasn't able to free himself even though he's innocent and he wasn't able to see his own mother. So I think that's something that the courts and legal officials don't take into play is that they're falsely incarcerating these people and they've had lives. They've had people who care about them and they're just stuck in a cell 24/7 every single day of the year without anyone to see them, without their families to take care of them. And it's a lot more than any of us could ever imagine. And I just think we all need to take that into play and then just let that revel in our minds for a little bit more because it's something that we kind of forget and we take um, advantage of. So, prediction of Jermaine's verdict. So, when I say this, it's going to sound extremely harsh, but I do not think that Jermaine's verdict will be released. I mean, yeah, I don't think he'll be released, and I don't think it will be reversed. So, I want to say this because the courts have ignored his decision and his petition for an exoneration trial for over 20 years, and his time in prison is almost coming to an end. So they might just let him play out the rest of his time until it's time for him to be released. But the process toward his exoneration is moving very slowly. And I think the courts are doing this on purpose because this is constantly what happens with exoneration cases. They kind of move it a lot, they drag it along a lot more than it should have because there are a lot of individuals who believe that they're falsely incarcerated. And there's so many of them that the courts, if the courts were to just take all of them into play, it would kind of seem like we have a legal system that has no idea what we're doing. Look at all these people who have been falsely incarcerated, and look at all these juries, the prosecutors. Look at what they're doing, and if they are openly able to say that we messed up, it's kind of like, why are we here in the first place? Why is the legal system there to take care of us if they're not actually right? So I think this is kind of like a pride thing in the courts. It's kind of like a legality for them not being able to say that we're not going to reverse the decision because of how much comes into play of these certain innocent individual trials. So this is not going to be a refusal to continue to fight for Jermaine. I think we should continue to fight for him. Should continue to try to get him out as much as he can because that's the type of fight that he deserves. But this realization must come into play that there are so many people like him who are going through the exact same situation that courts might not pay attention. They might not be able to take affirmative action, but that's what we need them to do. So they're going to maintain that the evidence used in the original trial, is something that um, doesn't need to be used at all, and that it's going to have to be able to be maintained. So I think that that's something that they're going to use to against Jermaine and his prosecutors is that the evidence in the original trial should be maintained and should be seen as correct, even though that it is not. So, and if innocent individuals are constantly portrayed as some type of villain, a murder is not a slight crime, and that's something that people will constantly see. And it's not easy for him to be able to say that he did not do it, even though there's a lot of evidence saying that he did it. But the public was easily convinced before, and it's going to be harder to flip that decision to try to turn them back onto his side. So the last slide, I'm gonna talk about learning from this class and this course. So this has to be one of my favorite courses that I take overall. I just want to say that I really enjoyed this course. Learning about this specific individuals and how just their lives overall, and just I want to be able to bring justice to them. I think it made me realize that my life is something that can easily be taken for granted every single day. I think being able to just go outside and not be harmed because of the color of my skin is a win in itself every single day. That's something that I constantly forget about and I constantly need to remember. And it's a scary life that I live because of how I look, but that's just something that I have to do. So these three BLM principles that I chose: restorative justice, empathy, and unapologetically Black. I want to fulfill and pass on my understanding through my writing. So in the same way that I want to continue to hear Black lives through my words, I want this course to help me continue this writing and continue to use my writing as a form of protest, but also as a form of an affirmative action. So in response to my restorative justice, writing can also be used to give people a voice who have not been given a voice in the first place. So many of my writings in this African American literature class that I've taken have included a lot of Black authors who turn something beautiful, who turn something painful into something extremely beautiful. The way that they were able to turn their turmoils of slavery and injustice and all of that into something that was a lot more powerful for someone to read. So I think when it comes to the principles, also to the principles of empathy, I want to be able to connect with a lot more people through my writing, to be able to put people in their shoes, to them understand how difficult it is to walk outside and be scared to walk outside. Just not being able to be comfortable in your own skin is something that we should all have the right to do, and that's something that we can't do as living in society as a woman of color. Um, I become deeply connected and interested in um, these cases and these lives of kind of like Oscar Grant, Rodney King, just becoming invested into who they were and how they lived on and how they were going to continue to live on in our lives is something that I want to do. So the power of my words is going to manifest itself into my life and probably throughout my entire life now that I've taken this course. And that's kind of made me more socially aware of what I need to be doing and how I need to be approaching this um, kind of this situation that's happening in society constantly. And I want to be able to use my voice, but not only my voice, but my words through my writing, to have people listen and listen to the cries of Black lives, because we've been screaming for so long and people have been seem to be ignoring us. So I think Black lives will continue to matter. They have always mattered. They always will matter. And I think it's a beautiful class to just sit and set it out to honor them and to restore their lives, powerful individuals, because they're not just victims. They were people just like us. They had lives, they had friends, they had family, they were human beings, and they were taken away from us. And as a society, we forget the privilege that we all have, not just the white privilege that we believe that white people have, but a privilege that even people of color, every single person has when it comes to just waking up another day. I mean, Breonna Taylor wasn't even given that privilege to wake up another day. She couldn't go to sleep without waking up. We forget how privileged we are to walk outside. Ahmaud Arbery couldn't even go outside to jog. We forget how privileged we are to use public transportation. Oscar Grant, he couldn't even get on his train to go back home with his daughter. There's so many things that we constantly take for granted because of how little society knows about the dangers of being Black, the dangers of not being able to walk outside. And it's dangerous for us to sit here and say that we will always be safe, because we won't. We have to be able to protect ourselves. There are so many things we do every day that is a risk for Black lives. So I think it's time for society to make an impact and to protect future generations from the pain that we will experience every single second. So I think it's up for us, for Black lives of now, Black lives of the past, Black lives of the future, to just make it apparent that we have to continue to fight for what our rights are, and for that we have an equal spot on this earth just like everyone else, and it can't be taken away from us any longer. And I think I will continue to fight for Black lives while saying their names throughout my entire life. So this is my works cited, and thank you so much for listening to me. Happy holidays.